Okay, well, I think we'll get started because we have quite a bit to get through. My name's Justin Johnson. I do work for IETA on the East Coast. I also am partner in a small consulting firm in Vermont. And prior to that, I worked in the Vermont state government, was a Secretary of Administration and Secretary of Natural Resources, and was heavily involved in the original design and implementation of RGGI. But we'll hear a bit more about that in a moment from Andrew McKeon, who's the Executive Director at RGGI. So he'll be next in the line. Then we have Patrick Cloutier from the Environment and Climate Change Canada, who will tell us a little bit about what's going on up in Canada at the moment. Then we have Emily Wimberger from the Huanani Partners. My Hawaiian is not that great. And she will tell us a little bit about what's going on in California, which is where we are. And then a late addition to the team, Luke Martland from Washington State will tell us a little bit about what's going on in Washington. And the idea here is that we're going to just say a little bit about what's currently happening, what's the status of these programs in the US states. We'll keep it fairly short. What we want to do is allow plenty of time for questions at the end. But Andrew, why don't we start with you and tell us a little bit about what's happening with RGGI.
Great. Well, thanks, Justin. And maybe if we could have that first slide. I just have a few slides that I wanted to show. You don't need to see me both on the screens and on the stage, so I think, if you don't mind, just a couple of slides. But one thing I will say is that Auction 60 is coming up in June, and that'll mark the 15th. Oh, here we go. Thank you. That'll mark the 15th year of a full cycle of quarterly auctions for RGGI. And we have about $6 billion in auction revenues. And, I remember when that used to be real money, $6 billion, But, so I guess I'm not making the slides work. Oh, I went through them all. Okay, thank you very much.
Any questions?
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about, so we've had a 15-year history, and one of the keys to the success of RGGI has been this idea of stepping back every few years, looking at what's been going right, maybe what's not been working so well, something we call program review. And I think one of the keys to the success of RGGI has been program review, and we're sort of right in the midst of that right now. So I'll talk a little bit about what's going on there. First, a commercial for a public meeting coming up on March 29th. That's next Wednesday. Invite anyone that's interested to attend that webinar. And basically, that'll be an update of what's been going on throughout the last year and change in terms of program review, giving an overview, talking a bit about the modeling strategy that we're using to do some electricity sector modeling and getting public comments from that. Then in the summer, we will then share some of the results of that electricity modeling, get more public input. By the fall, we would be conducting economic analysis and then releasing a draft model rule. And then finally, end of year into early next year, that would conclude program review and allow states then to begin their rulemaking. So that's the plan as of now. A couple of other things that I thought I would talk about regarding program review. Who's going to be participating as RGGI states going forward? So I talk a little about Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has a rule on the books, a RGGI rule that allows them to be a participating state. They've been welcomed in July 1st of last year by the other participating states as a participating state. Within a very short time frame after that, less than a month, the court stepped in and said that they couldn't participate in auctions and that they couldn't enforce compliance. And that is currently being adjudicated under the Pennsylvania Commonwealth Court, which is the second highest court in Pennsylvania. They're expecting an outcome very soon, this month or next on that. And if that goes well for the Pennsylvania DEP, then Pennsylvania would probably start participating immediately in auctions. That would probably mean the September auction. I don't know. But if it goes against Pennsylvania DEP, and the tea leaves say that the Commonwealth Court doesn't sound like they're supportive, but again, this is all tea leaves in my view. If they rule against, then the Governor Shapiro, has the option to take it to the Supreme Court. And it's not clear whether he will or not. That's a TBD. I will say that recent news reports say that they've included RGGI income in the budget for 2024. So that may give you a hint as to what they're thinking, but it's still a long way from a budget to actually taking the action they may need to take in order to participate in the auctions. So that's Pennsylvania. Virginia, their governor has decided to remove Virginia from participation in RGGI, and they're trying to do it in as sort of a smooth a fashion as possible, very similar to what New Jersey did way back in 2011, I think. They stayed till the end of a control period, and then they stepped out. So 2023 is the end of the fifth control period. They will be in through the end of 2023, participating fully through auction 62, and then they plan to leave. And I say they plan to leave. It is possible that there will be lawsuits against them leaving because of various sort of issues around their departure. There is legislation on the books in Virginia that's still on the books that says that they're participating. So it's possible there will be lawsuits. It's possible a court will say, they'll put a stay on their leaving, much like another court put a stay on Pennsylvania coming in. So these things are possible, but I'm just telling you right now as the facts as we see them. And then North Carolina, that's a developing situation. I think they had been hoping that if all went well with their public meetings and then their presentations to their environmental control board, that perhaps 2024 could be a year where they participate. It doesn't look like, as far as we can see right now, that 2024 is likely for them to participate, but that's still sort of a work in progress. And then finally, I just wanted to just show this slide because we heard a lot in a couple of other panels about the situation that we're all in. I just wanted to give a little hope here and show how one sector, the power sector that RGGI is involved with, has shown significant decreases. This is for U.S. emissions, by the way, over time from about 2010, which is the period in which RGGI started, to the present. Not trying to say that RGGI is fully responsible for this, and certainly we know that there have been fuel switching from coal to natural gas that's helped a lot of states reduce emissions, but RGGI has reduced emissions twice as fast in the utility sector as the nation as a whole. And so I think I think RGGI, as some people are also saying, well, with the Inflation Reduction Act and the hundreds of billions of dollars that may be available, is RGGI still relevant or even have a role? I think it has a very, very critical role to continue to send that signal of a cap reduction over time through the region. And as someone much smarter than me once said, that if you want to achieve transformation, you have to have constancy of purpose. And I think RGGI has represented over a decade and a half that constancy of purpose, that signal that's enabled what you're seeing there in terms of the power sector reductions. So that's...
Thanks, Andrew.
Sure.
So I think we'll move on then. We're sort of moving generally north and west, so we'll go to Canada next. This is a little bit different because we're talking about a federal program, but Patrick, over to you.
Thanks so much, and thanks for having me. So I think our Director General of the Carbon Markets Bureau spoke more generally about our national programs this morning. So being from the Offsets and Emissions Trading section within the Carbon Markets Bureau, I thought I'd focus on our offset credit system today. And so launched just in June of last year. It was originally developed to provide a alternative compensation option to facilities that are covered by our federal output-based pricing system. And so the three components are the regulations themselves, then the protocols, and I'll talk a little bit more about what protocols we have out, but we just released reducing greenhouse gas emissions from refrigeration systems protocol last month, and an update to our landfill methane recovery and destruction protocol. And then, of course, we have a credit and tracking system that right now can accept offset project applications. As soon as we have some project reports and some credits, then we will have a separate public-facing website with all that project information in it. But all of the credits are issued within the credit and tracking system, which is also linked to the OBPS system and actually our clean fuel regulations. And so these foundational elements were actually developed by the Canadian Council for Ministers of Environment. There's an offset project task force. And so these are the principles in our regulations. So all reductions that lead to offset credits must be real, quantifiable, additional, verifiable, and the plants are in my way. I should know this off the top of my head, but I think it says permanent and I should know my own slides. Unique, thank you very much. And I won't read these out, but these are the principles that we do follow. And then the federal offset protocols, because we do have regulations in various provinces and at the federal level on industrial sectors, these are the sectors that we focus on for project types. So the ones in red I just mentioned, we also are developing livestock feed management, enhanced soil organic carbon in the agricultural sector. We have plans in the future to develop a manure management protocol as well. In the waste sector, mentioned landfill, and then we just announced development of our anaerobic digestion protocol, and so that's an active development. And so we're looking for technical expert team members for that. We don't develop these all on our own. We really do rely on a group of technical experts that represent academics, proponents, verifiers, and other sector experts. And then in forestry, we're currently developing improved forestry management on private lands, and then we've planned to do IFM for crown lands as well on public lands. Then in the industrial section, we have the one I mentioned about refrigeration systems, and then we're currently developing a direct air capture and sequestration protocol as well. And then in the future, we do hope to develop a bioenergy and carbon capture sequestration protocol as well. And a lot more information is on our website, and if you have any questions, there's an email address there. Maybe I'll leave that on the screen if you wanted to write that down. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Patrick. So we'll move to Emily next. And prior to working at Huanani Partners, Emily was at Rhodium Group and before that at ARB. So I think she was chief economist at ARB, so is in a great position to say something about how things are going in California.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good explanation for why someone from a Hawaii-based organization is talking to you in California about the California Cap and Trade Program. And hopefully it wasn't just to put a woman on the panel. But I'm going to take off my regulatory hat a little bit and think about sort of where California is right now. There was just an auction conducted, the 34th joint auction with Quebec. And there's been a lot of activity in California on climate and air quality in the past year, the past few years, the past decades, but there's a lot of activity and a lot of really big ambition in California, and part of that is really going to, part of the legislative and the administrative efforts that have happened in California are going to affect the implementation of the Cap and Trade Program. And so I don't have to read the tea leaves about what California is planning to do in next steps with their Cap and Trade Program, because on February 28th of this year, they released a market report that basically outlined their principles in terms of the next regulatory set of amendments that they're going to be looking into over the next couple of years. So they made our job very easy. And they also made my slides very easy because these are literally screenshots of the ARB website. So really, I think modifications to California's cap-and-trade program are really in line with the ambition that we've seen in California over the past few years that came out of the 2022 scoping plan. There's a very large mandate for carbon neutrality by 2045 in California, and California is working to align its existing portfolio of policies and regulations to really align with that goal. There also are really strong signals in the scoping plan related to carbon capture, utilization, and storage, and direct air capture. So a lot of what is outlined here is really to make sure that all of the ambition that was outlined in the very public 2-year process of the scoping plan is reflected in all of these different programs like the low carbon fuel standard and the cap and trade program. So just sort of going through the list, I think a lot of this, it's rooted in sort of ARB's history and in California's history of really relying on data and science. I think it's often frustrating from the outside and the inside that things tend to move so slowly, but it really is rooted in this desire to, for program review, to collect data and to really base program design and implementation on the latest science. So you'll sort of see that reflected in all of these priorities that ARB has announced. And that's how you can tell when you worked for inside ARB. You call it ARB, you don't call it CARB. That was the rebranding. So there has been a lot of discussion about the stringency of the program through 2030 and overall banked allowances. And so rightfully so, ARB is going to be looking at sort of the stringency of the cap and how to handle these banked allowances, but in the overall context of program stringency and trying to hit the new advanced 2030 target of a 48% reduction as outlined in the 2022 scoping plan. So I think there is an acknowledgement that there will be an overall look at the caps. And again, that's going to be in the context of this really big ambition. There also is going to be, there's a retrospective electricity sector leakage study and also an industrial leakage sector study. So AB 398 that was passed in 2017 required the Air Resources Board by 2025 to evaluate the leakage across all different sectors in the economy. So with a nod to that, ARB will be undertaking that effort over the next few years. There's also, in the vein of keeping up with the latest science, going to be modifications made to offset protocols based on changing science and data. And again, this is not sort of a knee-jerk reaction to things that have happened, but again, is a slow, methodical look at how do we just make sure that we are relying on the latest science, the latest data, and really pushing the gold standard for offset usage and offset protocols writ large. There's some potential market updates related to CAISO. And one thing that is sort of near and dear to my heart, because when I was at Rhodium Group, worked on the 2022 scoping plan, doing the economic analysis, but really thinking about the economic impact to households. And so something that I think got lost a little bit in the noise of the scoping plan was that overall, there was a very small impact to California households from implementing the whole portfolio of policies to achieve carbon neutrality in 2045. If you unpack that a little bit, it really showed that lower income households, there was a negative effect that was offset by a benefit to richer households. And so part of this is really making sure that California's suite of policies and programs is affordable for especially the most vulnerable Californians, and that needs to be reflected across the whole portfolio of policies and programs. So there will be, I was really excited to see this bullet, that is a consideration because, inflation, gas prices, everything right now is just really, really expensive, and we want to make sure that this is not adversely impacting the most vulnerable communities in California. A big one also is the passage of SB 905, which really outlined a process for there to be carbon capture and storage in California. And as I said, that was really one of the big principles outlined in the 2022 scoping plan was the need for carbon dioxide removal in California. So there will be consideration of how do we think about working carbon capture into the cap and trade program, what does that look like, to really align with the administration's goals and the legislative goals that were outlined in California. So that's sort of, I think, I loved when they released this, and I think it's very in line with all the swirling that has been happening in California. It's a very intentional look to say, hey, we have a lot of really big, bold targets out there, and we need to make sure that we're aligned to meet California's targets. So with that, I will pass it to Washington.
Okay, well, yeah, so we'll go to the new kid on the block, as it were, just coming off their first auction. So Luke, why don't you tell us how that's going?
Great. Well, thank you very much for adding me to the panel. It's great to be here. My name is Luke Marland. I work for the state of Washington, the Department of Ecology, helping to set up and run the Cap and Invest program. So Washington State has now implemented a broad-based, economy-wide Cap and Invest program that covers roughly 70 to 75% of emissions statewide. And that program began on January 1st of this year. And our first auction was held towards the end of February. And that auction was a success. All of the allowances available were purchased. The settlement price was roughly in the range of one of these scenarios that had been modeled for us. And the total revenue raised was dramatically more than the legislature had estimated. Excuse me. And a majority of the allowances purchased in that auction were purchased by compliance or covered entities. So overall, we're very, very pleased with the results of the first auction. So now we have the Cap and Invest program up and running. The first auction has been a success, but Washington State is also doing many other things to address climate change and to decarbonize the state's economy. For example, the Clean Fuel Standard, or LCFS, also began this year. So Washington State overall, through a number of initiatives, is moving in a very aggressive fashion, but also a very well thought out fashion to pursue multiple policies to decarbonize the state's economy. And our goal is that by 2050, we'll have 95% reductions compared to prior levels, and we'll be at net zero. So Washington is moving in a positive direction, which is encouraging, which is positive, which indicates momentum. And the reason why I say that is this conference is very interesting so far because there's this balance. For example, the first speaker, between momentum and positivity, and then recognizing that we have so much more to do, and we're not near where we need to be, either as a country, for the United States, or as a world. And there's so much more we need to do. So it's a balance of that positive and the looming threat of climate change. And I hope that Washington State's example helps that positive outlook, because we were able to get the Cap and Invest program up and running in approximately a year and a half. From the starting point, when the legislation was passed, to turning on the switch and beginning the program. It was only approximately 1.5 years, which I believe is unprecedented. And the reason why we were able to do that successfully is we didn't try to reinvent the wheel. We learned from California. We learned from Quebec, who were so helpful to us. We learned from the knowledge base that already is out there from other programs. So we didn't try to reinvent the wheel. We took that template, and there's some changes, some things that we would characterize as improvements. For example, a greater emphasis on equity and environmental justice. But we really took that template that exists, and as a result, we were able to get our program up and running in a very short period of time. And I hope that's a cause for optimism. And I believe that it means that other states and jurisdictions can do the same thing and learn from that template and hopefully get similar programs up and running equally quickly.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
So as you can see, there's a lot happening right across the country and across Canada as well. Many similarities, but also some differences. I'll start with the first question to Luke. Does your program have built into it a regular program review process like they have in RGGI, for instance?
It does. There's a number of reports that we're mandated to issue, and I forget the due dates for all of them. But for example, we are supposed to do a program analysis and do a report to the legislature, and I forget the due date for that. But there are mandated times when we need to report back and demonstrate how the program is functioning. There's also a mandate that, and at this point we're still building the structure to do this, that state government track all the expenditures. So equally important with the cap is the invest and how the money is invested. And there's a requirement that that be tracked and there be some kind of demonstration that those projects and those initiatives, and by the way, the legislature decides how the money is spent. We don't in ecology. But that those programs and initiatives really are resulting in greenhouse gas reductions and doing so in a very cost-effective manner. So there's multiple levels of tracking and reporting back as to the program.
And just while I'm on the program review piece, Andrew, the RGGI program review, this is the third one, I think, is taken some time. I think, it's probably taken longer than you sort of originally planned. One question I had was, do you think there's any value in RGGI considering having a more structured sort of timetable around program review so that market participants can feel like, they don't necessarily know what the outcome of the review is going to be, but they would know more definitively when it was going to happen?
No. Seriously, as I said earlier, program review has been a key to RGGI's success. The first program review came when the program was so oversupplied with allowances that the clearing price was going on at the reserve for like 2 years straight of auctions. So they knew something had to be done. At that point, it was stepping back. And then I think the wording that is used each time is that we set a date for when a program review will be sort of reinitiated. So after the last program review in 2017, it was said that by 2021 we would reinitiate, or the states would reinitiate. I'm always being very careful not to speak for the states. These are the state decisions. But to get to your question, whether it would make sense or be helpful to have more structure, I can understand the perspective of folks who are following, RGGI and the markets and wanting to get more certainty about it by having a sense of when they can look forward to those changes coming. But on the other hand, you have a lot of dynamics and a lot of fluidity in RGGI right now. I alluded to the fact that we're not clear as to whether some states will be in or be out. There's also the issue of what the federal government is doing with the IRA and other things that have really come into the conversation amongst the states about program review. And I think it's one of the reasons why maybe it's been a little bit later than we might have anticipated. So I think to sort of put in place a structure and an end date could be difficult for states to address sort of the dynamics of the market. And I think that's probably a reason why they may not choose to do that. But it is possible, and I would say that if stakeholders think that's a good idea, I would recommend that stakeholders make that known.
Right, because we have a comment period coming up,
Yeah.
right? When the 29th meeting happens, that opens a comment period. So
Right.
That's good to know. Are there any questions from the audience? I mean, I can keep going, but we should hear from, you don't want to hear what I want to know. We want to hear what you want to know. So yes, in the front here.
Hi, Luke Sherman from South Pole. My question is actually for Patrick from the Government of Canada. I understand that the compliance or credit and tracking system that is used to track and issue offsets to the GHG offset credit system projects under the Government of Canada's system is not open to the general public, but that in the future, a public registry for all the projects will be launched. And I was wondering if you could share any timelines about when you expect that public registry to be available for review by the general public. And also, if you could share your thoughts about when the first projects are anticipated to be actually registered and issued offsets, because I imagine that the reason it hasn't launched yet is because there hasn't been any projects registered quite yet. But please correct me if I'm wrong.
Okay, great question. Thanks for that. And there is someone that's here at the conference as well, my colleague Ava Burton. So if I get anything wrong, she can correct me later on. But that's right. So, our offset system just launched, like the regulations themselves were just published in June of last year. And while the credit and tracking system has been operational for the federal output-based pricing system for a while, it needed to be updated for the offset system. And so right now we're working with one application for registration for an offset project. And I think that's for the landfill protocol. We just, in last month, published the refrigeration protocol. And so absolutely, we're committed to transparency, and once we do have some, as you mentioned, have some projects and some information to share publicly, that public view of the registration, the CATS, the offset registry will be available, absolutely. In terms of timelines, I mean, we're hoping if we get some applications to registration this year, then first project reports will be next year, because there is a requirement that the first project report is submitted after the first 12 months of implementation of the project. And then after that, with credit issuances, there would be a public view of that. Thanks for your question.
Well, we'll do one here and then one way in the back.
Hi, my name is Nick Berkey with Anaheim Public Utilities. I just am really excited to ask this question because you don't often get 3 different cap and trade style programs all in one stage. So, as Emily mentioned earlier, one of the items that the ARB is looking to address is equity and environmental justice issues. So my big question is, with the current California cap and trade program, it's been shown that emissions in, say, the Central Valley and other areas have actually increased and not decreased over time because companies are willing to pay to pollute, for lack of a better term. Is there any consideration to implementing kind of a hybrid approach where there's also a command and control aspect of your respective markets to decrease regional or localized emissions in terms of to satisfy environmental justice aspects? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, there was a recent study that was released out of the university, or Arizona State University, that actually showed the opposite of that, that in communities that were farther behind in terms of air quality disparities actually made up ground under cap and trade. So what that was showing is that there is not, I think that there has been a lot of discussion about sort of the causality or the correlation between greenhouse gas emissions and localized air pollutants. And it's a really hard chemistry problem. I'm not a scientist, so I cannot tell you even to start to tell you about that. But I know it's a really complicated issue. But there have been recent studies that have not shown that there is an increase in air pollution because of the cap and trade program. So I think it's important, data is evolving, science is evolving, and it's really important that we make sure that we are getting sort of that argument right. And I think in California, there's a whole toolbox. We always joke there's 12 belts and 11 pairs of suspenders when it comes to climate and air quality policy. And it's not just an issue about let's reduce carbon emissions. It's a really complicated objective function. We have to think about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We have to reduce local air pollution. We have to ensure affordability. We have to really, it's a really complicated piece that is also dictated through a lot of different pieces of legislation that requires different mandates. So California is working in a really complex space, and especially in areas of California that have the worst air quality in the nation, to really make sure that air pollution reductions are central and a tenet of a carbon-based program. It's a little strange because the cap and trade program obviously is the tool that is used to reduce carbon emissions, but there do need to be considerations and sort of support to ensure that we're not increasing air pollution, and we are reducing it in communities that are frontlined and are overburdened by air pollution and environmental considerations. So I think, yes, there is definitely an equity lens that is necessary when it comes to carbon markets and ensuring that communities feel the value and the benefit of a carbon trading program. That can be through investments that are made into local communities. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, that's the sort of the California program that does put money back into disadvantaged communities. So that's a really important piece, but also that communities do feel they have the information that they need to think about carbon pricing, that they do have the data to understand the impacts to their pocketbooks, to their environment, to their local climate. So I think there is a really big push, and there's a lot of tools that California has at its disposal, not just sort of the cap and trade program, but AB 617 and different mandates that really are targeting air pollution in ways that, how do we find the best tool to impact air pollution in California? And there needs to be consideration of equity in the cap and trade program, but I think it's an all hands on deck and a multi-tooled approach that will be necessary.
In the way in the back. We'll get there.
Thanks. Hi, Matt Lithgow with Carbon Pulse. Couple of questions here. The first one would be for the Reggie folk on the panel. So Andrew, you spoke a little bit about, Justin's question about, potentially having like set deadlines in order to complete program reviews. Current program review, as Justin mentioned, has been delayed already. Program meeting is just resuming next week on that. Wonder if you can provide any insight as to whether we'll definitively get that model rule finalized by the end of the year, because in the last update that Reggie put out in the fall, pushing back the meeting, the end date for the model rule being completed and updated still stayed for this December. So wondering if you could comment on that, and maybe Justin, in your previous life as a Reggie on the Reggie board, you'd be able to provide some insight on whether or not that's actually realistic to turn around in the current time frame. And then my second question would go for Luke over in Washington State. So currently, Washington allows for carbon offsets under the program. There's no supply yet. There's a couple of protocols that were borrowed from California, but there's currently no process for CCOs that have been issued from within Washington State to transfer over to being issued as Washington carbon offsets, essentially. We already had one auction take place near the first trigger price of the allowance price containment reserve, and we're currently trading above that in the secondary market. So going forward here over the first compliance period, wondering if you'd be able to speak to when we might see some guidance on when or how offsets either issued in California could transition over to Washington program, or when we might start seeing Washington carbon offsets being developed, greenfield projects, let's say, and when those might start to get online based on conversations you've had with project developers and applicants and so on. Thanks.
So we'll start with Andrew.
Okay. Yeah. So the short answer is that's the plan, to have the model rule completed by the end of this year. And I guess one might ask the question, well, what could get in the way of that? Again, I can't speak beyond what the states have said they plan to do, which is to complete that by the end of the year. But there is fluidity. There are issues around the participation of some states. Could that impact that? Perhaps. But I would say that the plan for the states today is to get this completed this year.
And I'll just add, because one of the great things about not being in government anymore is I can say things I couldn't always have said, perhaps. But the one thing that worries me a little bit about the process at this point is, New York now is in the process of doing pre-rulemaking and getting ready to implement a state cap and invest program in New York State. My guess is that a lot of the people who are working on that also work on RGGI, and if they have to do an updated RGGI rule, I wouldn't say it was impossible, but I think the timeline will be pretty tight, and it certainly wouldn't want to slip any more. We should remember, though, that the very first RGGI auction, New York was not actually a participant in that auction because they hadn't got their rule completed yet. And I only mention that to suggest that it's possible that they could get the model rule done, states could be going through this process, and we get to a point where most of the states are in an auction, but one of them or some number of them are not because they're not ready yet. That's not the end of the world. They could come back in then at the next auction. I mean, it's not ideal, but it has happened in the past, and it could happen again. But I think absolutely we'd like not to see it slip any further. I think that's going to put a lot of pressure on the folks who actually have to do the work on the rules. But Luke, had enough time to work all the offset challenges there?
So I'm glad there was a question about offsets, because I think it's a good example of how we took from and learned from California and Quebec, but also made some tweaks. So we adopted California protocols. We did not adopt two of them. I think one was rice cultivation and one was mine methane. We did not adopt, but we adopted the others. So we took what exists, but we made some tweaks. For example, we require more direct environmental benefits to Washington State. So there's some differences. We are working on guidance and getting the offset part of our program up and running. And you're lucky enough to have two experts sitting behind you from ecology. One is Jordan Wildish, who's in charge of our offset program, and also Bill Drumheller, who works on a number of things, but also has deep knowledge in offsets. So I'd encourage you, or anybody in the audience for that matter, to approach them if you have questions about more specific things and when we think we'll get the guidance out there and more implementation-directed questions. I think they might be able to help you out.
Okay, right in the back, down by the sound guy.
Mike Taylor with Aegis Hedging Solutions. This is for Luke as well. Could you speak a little bit on the allowance price containment reserve? If it does get triggered later on this year, I think there's approximately maybe 18.6 million. And how would that be broken down into Tier 1, Tier 2? Is there any purchase limits, and is it just for compliance entities?
Good questions. We had a settlement price, I believe was $48.50, and adjusted for inflation, that was within one of the ranges we had tasked out. But the Tier 1 APCR price is, I believe, 51 something. I may not get the number correct off the top of my head. So we're getting closer to it. So we'll see how the market moves. In our rules, if you read some of our rules, if we do breach that or get to that price, we would then have an APCR auction. We, in our rulemaking, actually took a step to make sure we had sufficient allowances. We did what we call front loading. So we put all the allowances that would normally be available year by year that would have gone to the APCR, the allowance price containment reserve. We swept them all from this year to 2030 and put them in the allowance APCR all at once. And that was meant to send a signal to the market that we would have sufficient firepower, sufficient allowances if we get to that point. And if that we do get to the point, they're available to compliance entities. They're available to covered entities or opt-in entities. They're not available to what we call general market participants, which would be traders in the market to buy and sell allowances and make a profit. So we'll see what happens in the next auction, which is coming up at the end of May. And if we do get to the trigger price, then we'll have the APCR auction. The details as to what date that would be, if necessary, we're still working on right now. But we will issue a notice that would announce that, and we'll give the market information about that.
Okay, giving the microphone person a workout here.
Yeah, hi there. I'm Slade Rand with Opus. My question is for Washington as well. I'm wondering if you all have, if you anticipate increased participation in this upcoming May auction based on maybe ease of registering for it and becoming an approved participant.
It could happen. We were pretty pleased with the participation we had. I mean, we've been actually very pleased with our outreach to covered entities and their registration, and we use WCI Inc. platform, same as California, Quebec. We were pleased with the number of entities and the mix of entities that registered to participate in the auction, not just participate in the program. And I'm sure many of you have seen it, but we released that list of those entities that were approved to participate in the auction, not saying whether they actually did or not. So we thought there was strong demand and strong interest, and we thought it was a good mix of the type of entities. Whether that will increase or not, there's other covered entities. They will have to at some point participate. So we assume that would grow, but auction by auction, whether it will increase or decrease, I don't think I could really predict that.
Other questions? Yeah, just straight back.
Thank you. Hey, Chris Terriazos from Atos Capital. My question is with respect to Washington State. If the premium price of Washington State credits holds over California carbon allowances, how might that encourage or discourage your decision to link with the California program?
I missed a little bit of what you said, encourage or discourage, and then I lost a few words.
How much would that encourage or discourage your decision to link Washington State with the California program?
Well, let me tell you about the process that we're undertaking to look at potential linkage. And this is Washington's process. But I can't tell you as any ultimate decision, obviously. So we're mandated in statute in what we call the Climate Commitment Act. Really, I think the Climate Commitment Act envisioned that Washington might link. And in our rulemaking and other processes, we tried to be what we call linkage ready. So that's sort of the foundation. But we are also required to go through a thorough process to look at certain criteria and determine if they're met before Washington State makes a decision to link. We've begun that process. So I introduced two of my teammates earlier. Behind you is Stephanie Potts, who's in charge of the linkage process. And we've begun engagement with tribal staff. We've reached out to the Environmental Justice Council. We've begun public listening sessions. So we're beginning those pieces of our process. And we'll continue that over the next few months. Our goal is that at the end of the summer or early fall, our boss, the head of Department of Ecology, would make her decision whether Washington will pursue linkage. It's only a Washington decision. And we do not need a statute to enable linkage. We don't need a statute authorizing linkage. We don't need a new rule authorizing linkage. We may need statutory amendments or rule changes to make sure that our program is similar to other jurisdictions if indeed we get to linkage. But our director is enabled to make that decision herself. So that's our time frame. We do the public engagement, we do the outreach, we look at these criteria that need to be met, and then she would make a decision whether to pursue linkage. At that point, then it's really up to the other jurisdictions. It'd be up to California and Quebec, for example, to engage in their own processes, to look at their own criteria, to have their own decision-making process, whether they also are interested in linkage. So we've begun our piece of that puzzle, but there's other pieces that would remain after we determine whether we want to pursue linkage. But we are doing our piece of that and in a quick time frame.
So just before we move off that one, this idea of linkage, I know it's very early days for New York, but I have a question both for Andrew and for Emily. Andrew, I'm just interested whether RGGI Inc. has had any conversations with New York about it's not linkage per se, but how they would deal with being in RGGI and also having their own program.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think a lot of people are thinking about New York. They've got an economy-wide program now, and currently their goal is to execute both that economy-wide program and maintain their participation in RGGI as it is now. And that works in with the whole program review process as well. But their goal is to be a full participating state as they continue to move forward with their economy-wide program.
And Emily, we can have this conversation because we're both, I'm looking in at New York and you're looking in at California, and we're not actually in there, but it's hard for me to imagine New York would build this program without talking to California. But I also suspect they may want to build it and stamp it with Made in New York before they actually do something with California. But my question to you is, with your knowledge of California, do you think that's the right way to go? Do you think would a linkage between New York and California be a good thing, and what might be their best path to get there?
Well, I think similar, and I should note Mark Cipolla is in the back, and he's the cap and trade chief at ARB, so I will watch my words carefully. But similar to Washington, there is there's a linkage process outlined in California that requires very thoughtful steps, and it would require that there be, New York would have a program, to stand up a program on its own before there would be linkage. And there's a whole host of different steps through the WCI platform. That being said, I think California talks to everybody, and everybody talks to everybody, because it doesn't make sense to reinvent the wheel every time when it comes to carbon markets. And we need to sort of lean on, stand on the shoulders of giants in thinking about design and design principles that have persisted through RGGI and through California's history, and now are being used in Washington. So there's a set of principles that have shown great success, and there's also cautionary tales of things that should be considered. So I think linkage is always a possibility in California, and I mean, that's sort of the whole point. It's, you know, we want this, we want carbon pricing to proliferate and to be, you know, more universal than it is. But there is a very long process that California would have to go through, and New York would have to have a stand-up program on its own before that conversation could happen.
Okay, and 2 questions there, so.
Hi, Luke Sherman from South Pole again. I actually have a question for you, Luke, from Government of Washington. My understanding is that for the state of Washington to actually proceed with a linkage with California or any other jurisdiction with regard to TTS, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that the analysis has to show that it wouldn't undermine the environmental integrity of Washington State TTS or endanger achievement of Washington State's statutorily mandated greenhouse gas emission reduction goals and obligations. And my question then builds on what was asked earlier, is given the meaningful price difference in allowance and auction settlement prices of Washington and California and Quebec, how would a determination not arrive at the conclusion that as long as there's this at least meaningful difference in the allowance price, that greenhouse gas emission reductions wouldn't shift to California because there's cheaper abatement opportunities and a lower carbon price, since there would be full fungibility of allowances across jurisdictions. I'm just struggling to understand how there could be any other conclusion possible, and wondering if I'm missing something there.
I'm smiling because they're asking about the conclusion. And so I think you know what my answer will be. We haven't done that process yet. And I'm sorry, I can't see you behind the podium there. We haven't done that process yet. We haven't analyzed the various criteria yet. We've just begun our process of public engagement and outreach and getting points of view concerning linkage or the possibility of linkage and these criteria. So I can't prejudge what we will find or what our analysis will reveal. And then, of course, we would present that analysis to our boss, the Director of Ecology, and she would make her decision whether to pursue linkage. So I cannot answer your question at this point. Hopefully, sometime during the summer, we'll have completed our analysis and be able to brief her on our suggestions and criteria. But I can't give you an answer right now.
Okay, and I think we have time for one more question right behind you there. So.
Hello, my name is Will from Carbon Pulse. I have a question for Patrick. 2 questions for Patrick. They're related, I promise.
I almost escaped.
As you mentioned, there's only been one application to the Canadian offset program, the federal offset program, since June. Is ECCC at all concerned about demand for the federal offset program? And do you anticipate in the future that Canadian companies will be able to use federal offsets to meet their compliance obligations outside of the output-based pricing system? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for that question. So in terms of just one application so far, landfill is kind of an old and new protocol at the same time. And so the way our system works is that if there's already an offset protocol in place in a provincial system, then the federal offset protocol does not apply if it's the same project type or cover the same activities. And so in the jurisdictions that already had the landfill protocols, this is kind of an older protocol or very well established, and in a lot of ways it was a good one for us to start with because we had a lot of protocols to look at. And then of course in regions of the country where they weren't under an offset protocol, it's something that maybe they had started regulations around or maybe had other strategies to reduce landfill emissions. So part of the slow uptake of landfill is just the nature of that protocol, I think. And then I think in terms of demand, so I mentioned, yes, originally we did set up the offset system for a compensation option in the federal OBPS, but that's not the only place where we think the federal offset credits will be used. So we have something called the Strategic Assessment of Climate Change, and so major development projects can purchase offset credits to mitigate some of those impacts. We also have some green and government initiatives where the federal government will purchase offsets. There's also voluntary demand for our compliance credits. We're also hearing there's a possibility that instead of a provincial government developing their own protocol, perhaps a federal offset protocol, if that project is based in their province, could maybe one day be accepted, perhaps, we don't know. And then, of course, we do have a couple other federal compliance systems coming out in the future. So a discussions paper was released last year around an oil and gas sector cap, and in their design paper, they are considering the use of federal offset credits. As well into the future, we're planning and I'm trying to do this really quickly. We're also planning a clean electricity standard, and in their design considerations, they're also thinking about federal offset credits. And so as we work towards meeting our Paris goals, it's an ambitious goal, and we do think the demand will be there for federal offset credits. But we're just at the beginning stages right now. We don't even have any credits yet, so we're just trying to get things going as well as we can. And then, sorry, what was the last part of that question? That's not something that we've considered right now. And so just so I'm sure, I understand that fully, you're saying companies covered by the federal OBPS, will they be able to use offsets from outside of the federal offset system? Oh, I did answer it? Oh, okay. Well, I'll just put in a little plug. For one thing that is something that I want to thank our partners in Alberta for is something called recognized units. And so I'm not sure if people realize, but we did have the very first submission of what we call recognized units by a covered facility in the OBPS, and they used Alberta offset credits to compensate for their emissions in the federal offsets, in the federal OBPS, which was the first time there was ever any interjurisdictional transfer of emissions reduction. So we're really happy about that, and we want to thank the folks in Alberta. And I don't know if she's listening, but Amanda Stupark is probably the key person in Alberta that we worked with on that.
Okay, well, thanks very much. I think that brings us to the end of the time. So I'd just like to thank all of our presenters for your time, and thank you all for coming along. We'll all be around, I think, so if you have any other burning questions, you can find us. And I think now it's lunchtime, so I don't want to hold you up. So thank you. Thank you.